Well, the phones will be running hot this weekend as the numbers are crunched ahead of next Tuesday's Liberal Party Room meeting. As we've heard, the current leader, Malcolm Turnbull, insists he'll fight on. So can the next week bring anything but further turmoil to the opposition? To discuss the various scenarios that may lie ahead, we're joined in Canberra by the Financial Review's Laura Tingle and in Sydney by the Australian's Peter Van Onselen. Welcome to both of you.
Good to be here.
Thanks, Lee. Laura Tingle, what do you anticipate is going to happen at this meeting on Tuesday morning at this stage?
Lee, it's interesting, isn't it? I think we've all leapt well beyond Malcolm Turnbull to the Hockey and Abbott scenarios, but we saw earlier this evening on the 7:30 report that Malcolm Turnbull really doesn't want to go anywhere. If you actually think about what's going to happen on Tuesday morning, without Joe Hockey moving and with Turnbull maintaining his line, which I'm presuming he will do, it becomes a question for the party room about it being Malcolm Turnbull versus Tony Abbott. And I think that's still going to be a reasonably tight vote, despite the fact that even some of Malcolm Turnbull's closest supporters have essentially put up the white flag and think that he probably should stand down. If it becomes a question of do you vote for Malcolm Turnbull or do you vote for Tony Abbott, a lot of small L Liberals will still find it pretty hard to choke on the idea of voting for Tony Abbott.
So you think even though it's a slim possibility that it is possible that Malcolm Turnbull could hang on?
It defies all belief that he would hold on, Lee, but I'm just saying that we shouldn't just immediately assume that it'll be a shoo-in at this stage. We don't know enough about whether Joe Hockey can be persuaded to change his position. And one thing that's been missing this week is the chance for anybody to have any time to think about anything. Communications are now so instantaneous that everybody's leaping in. We've now got the opposition party room in a position to go away, think very coolly about things for the next few days, work out what their constituents think, and also think through where the party's going to end up depending on the various leadership scenarios. Now, I can't see a good one with Malcolm Turnbull because he can't unite the party, but they are still going to find if it's a choice between Turnbull and Abbott, it could be still a relatively close vote.
Peter Van Onselen, let me put the same question to you. What do you think is going to happen?
I think Turnbull is in diabolical trouble no matter what happens. There's no doubt that if Joe Hockey puts his hand up and he's prepared to challenge Turnbull, which he's indicated he won't, but he's got some time to think about that. If he does do that, I think Turnbull, other than for the sake of his pride, his numbers would be literally in the handful. But if it's Tony Abbott, it is a different situation. I agree with Laura about that. But I think that there'd be two factors at play. One that works against Malcolm Turnbull, and that is that I think a lot of marginal seat MPs would probably say this is not going to stop. There is no point sticking with a leader. In a sense, the response they had to Brendan Nelson when Turnbull came in, there's no point sticking with him, and they would shift to the new leader. The other factor works in Turnbull's favour, but it's really just showmanship. I think that there would be some votes sticking with Turnbull for a pride factor, so that he doesn't do a Mark Latham perhaps, so that holding the seat of Wentworth doesn't perhaps become the same issue that it might otherwise become. But I do think that in essence it would be a closer vote, but it would still be a relatively clear vote to Tony Abbott if it went that way.
So Joe Hockey's the unknown here. What sort of calculations would he be making at the moment?
Well, he's in a very tough position. I think he at a selfish level he would be thinking, is it my time? Probably not. But he would also be thinking again at a selfish level that if he doesn't put his hand up now, as someone who privately was a little critical of Peter Costello for not ever putting his hand up, that he should maybe consider doing so. At a party level, and this is where the real pressure's coming on him from the likes of Nick Minchin and others, there is a view that he is the best person for the job, the best person to unify the two factions of the party and give them the best opportunity at the next election. And it's very hard as the hours tick by for him to reject those calls as somebody who is a creature of the Liberal Party.
So if Hockey enters the race, who do you think is likely to emerge the victor?
Oh, certainly Joe Hockey. If Joe Hockey puts his hand up and he's prepared to challenge Turnbull, that'll be a pretty tough decision for him. They are pretty close, but he would win overwhelmingly. What he will be hoping happens is that Turnbull over the weekend has the time to consider his position, and possibly even if it does go to a spill, if Turnbull loses the spill, as I expect he would, Joe Hockey will be hoping that Turnbull then withdraws gracefully, which there is still some prospect of.
Laura Tingle, do you agree that if Hockey enters the race that Hockey's the likely victor?
Yes, I do agree with that, partly because Tony Abbott has said he would withdraw. But I also would question, though, whether it's a really good thing for Joe Hockey personally and even for the Liberal Party for him to run, despite the chaotic other options. Joe Hockey is identified very closely with Malcolm Turnbull's position on the emissions trading scheme, but this is a much bigger break in the party than just about the emissions trading scheme. Joe Hockey is a small L Liberal. Somebody said to me today that the Liberals are essentially run by the Taliban now. You know, it's really a very balkanised, very wild party. Joe is a very jovial, unifying person, I think a bit like Kim Beazley was for the Labor Party. But what would happen if Joe Hockey won next week? Joe Hockey would probably allow the deferral of the ETS to go ahead. In February, the coalition would have to come up with a new position, not necessarily an ETS, and he would be under the same sorts of pressures from the hardliners that Malcolm Turnbull has been under previously. How would he deal with that? How much credibility would he have? Does he have the political skills to do that? And I think that's a really big question. Are they only deferring or putting off for a couple of months the current brawl by putting Joe Hockey into that? Would he actually resolve the question? And I think that's the really big dilemma for the Liberal Party, because I don't think he does resolve the dilemma. Tony Abbott is also problematic because he represents a climate change versus climate change sceptic election option. So I don't think there is a really clear option, but Joe Hockey looks very attractive to the coalition at the moment because he looks like a unifying ticket.
Let me ask about Labor's strategy here. Laura Tingle, what is going to happen with the ETS vote? You talk about Joe Hockey putting it off, but is it possible that vote could happen before Tuesday?
I can't see how, Lee. Essentially, the government had it open to them to move a gag motion, that's to shut down the debate on the ETS in the Senate today if it so desired. But to get that vote, it needs 7 Liberals to vote with it. And the one thing that seems to have been absolutely immovable is that Liberals of any persuasion will not vote against shutting up their colleagues on the Liberal Party Liberal Party benches. So that option is not there.
Peter Van Onselen, the right wing of the Liberal Party clearly believes that there's political hay to be made in going to an election where they can have an anti-ETS platform and fight the Rudd government on climate change. Is there evidence that would back that position?
Well, I think the evidence that they think backs that position, although I think this is a little dodgy, is the idea of a GST campaign. Andrew Robb was the federal director of the Liberal Party when he was running John Hewson's GST campaign, and he saw very much firsthand just how ferocious an anti-GST campaign could be when Paul Keating ran it. There is some suggestion in Liberal circles that they would feel comfortable doing the same sort of thing to the Rudd government, but the reason I think that it's not as strong as some of them would like to believe it is not just the fact that they're taking on a government rather than an opposition as it was in 1993, but the GST versus the emissions trading scheme are quite different issues when you look at the published polls showing just how much people want action on climate change, and also the fact that that we haven't actually had this thing in any way, shape or introduced, and the details of it not being known probably means that people aren't as frightened of it, whereas there were a lot more details known, albeit in a frightening way, about the GST when John Hewson released Fightback.
So a scare campaign based around the ETS versus the Rudd campaign, which would presumably be that they're climate sceptics, do-nothings. You think the Rudd campaign would have more resonance?
I think that the Rudd campaign would hold comfortably enough when you add Rudd's personal popularity to it. That would be the way that I would describe it. It would be a case of, often in politics, strategists talk about how fear is more successful than hope. But in this case, I think that the idea of hope, as in hope of doing something about the environment, combines itself with the fear of if you don't do something about the environment. I think that would trump a fear campaign purely on the technical detail of the ETS.
Laura Tingle, what do you think? Do you think that there's a groundswell out there of anti-Rudd sentiment around the ETS just waiting for the coalition to tap into?
I don't think it's anti-Rudd sentiment. I think one of the really big complexities of the way this has unfolded is you've actually got 2 different arguments going on, partially unleashed, I have to say, by the climate change sceptics themselves. Instead of having just a debate about whether the emissions trading scheme is the best way to deal with climate change, we've got a debate going on about that at one level, but we've also had Nick Minchin saying that that climate change is all a communist plot, and so we also got a brawl about whether it's climate change or not climate change. Now, I notice now that Nick Minchin is trying to bring it back into being a debate just about the emissions trading scheme, but this is a really hard thing for the coalition to control. The government would love to run a climate change skeptics argument against the coalition. I don't think it is viable. I think Malcolm Turnbull is right on this, and in some ways he has set down the parameters of the next election campaign when he said we cannot not have a position on climate change, which means that if that is right and the coalition rejects the ETS, that is Labor's ETS, they're going to have their own model. And Labor then has another decision. Does it change its emissions trading scheme for a fourth time, now that people really don't understand it, or do they go back to the drawing board somehow and do something different as well? So is it going to be a battle of models, or is it going to be a battle of climate change versus not doing anything about climate change?
Peter Van Onselen, is this row bigger than the ETS legislation?
I think when you say this row, how do you mean?
I mean, in the Liberal Party, is it about more than this policy? Is it about more than Malcolm Turnbull's leadership even?
I think it is. I think there is a fundamental split that is going on between conservative forces and moderate forces, and it's not quite as clear as that because personality comes into it as well. But it would be a mistake to think that it would be anywhere near as bad as this had it not been for the twin issues of climate change and the ETS, which both sides are passionate about, and the way that Malcolm Turnbull has managed the matter over the last few months by not being as consultative or not being as respectful of his backbench as he perhaps could have been had he been a little bit more strategic about it. I mean, I agree with Laura that as far as Malcolm Turnbull is concerned, I think he had the strategy right initially, but it was his way of enacting it, his way of bringing people with him where he let himself down badly and has found himself where he is now. I think that the divides in the party, though, are deeper, but they'll probably be able to bandage over them in the short term to fight an election. Whoever becomes leader won't be rolled before the next election. They'll bandage over it, they'll try to get together, they'll try to hold their base in place. But if it all fails at the election, as it most likely will, that's when we're going to really see the mettle of this Liberal Party and its ability to stay united after that.
And presumably, let's say the leader is either Joe Hockey or Tony Abbott. They both come from those two sides within the party.
They do, but Joe Hockey doesn't present the same problems as Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott is a much more polarising figure. Joe Hockey, it looks like from people I'm talking to, is getting the cover of Nick Minchin and the Conservatives, therefore that he is the dominant factional leader of. So the Joe Hockey option is the unifying option because he comes with strings attached, and that is the very powerful weight of Nick Minchin to keep the Conservative forces in line.
Kevin Rudd is in a very commanding position in the polls. Laura Tingle, until people start to tire of him or the government starts to lose public support, how much do the opposition's internal woes matter?
Well, they matter at this stage mainly because they just look completely unelectable. I mean, it's as simple as that. Without a doubt, Kevin Rudd's extraordinary position in the polls is magnified by the fact that they just aren't an alternative option. Could I just add one other thing about the whole question about the coalition, Lee? One thing we haven't talked about tonight is the Nationals. The National Party embarked basically under Barnaby Joyce rather than Warren Truss on this path of product differentiation earlier this year. One of the really interesting questions coming out of what happens next week is if either Tony Abbott or Joe Hockey are successful and become leaders, what do the Nationals do? Do they keep differentiating? I think they do, and that raises really interesting questions about three-cornered contests in a lot of very marginal seats, which both might think that they can pick up from Labor against each other, and that could still be a really sharp point of pressure, if you like, on coalition policy, pushing it towards on Liberal Party policy and on the coalition policy, pushing it towards the right, which will just keep the tensions up.
We're out of time. Laura Tingle, Peter Van Onselen, thank you very much. Pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lee.